Hello class, we're going to be discussing a bit more thesis writing and thesis practice because you are going to do it a lot this year. And we are going to also talk about two civilizations, the Indus River Valley civilization and the Olmec today. So we're going to talk about two separate civilizations, but let's get started with some writing. Some more thesis statements. Thesis statements are, remember, a one-sentence argument. So pretend that this is your question here that you're going to have on the exam. How did geography affect the development of Egyptian civilization? So I'm asking you, can you go and study the relationship between geography and then the civilization? What was the relationship between the two? Now here's the part that gets a little tricky. You actually don't want to use the words geography or effect. I want you to show how you know the geography or how you know the effect, which is a bit more difficult because when you do this, it has to show that you know what you're talking about. We're getting past these kind of middle school answers where you parrot the questions back, where you say, geography affected the development of Egyptian civilization by, I'm going to show you an example on this next slide about how to get around this. So, an example of a poor thesis statement would be something along the lines of, the geography of Egypt affected the Egyptians a lot. It's not saying anything, it's very general. There's no argument. You can't really do much with that. A bit better would be along the lines of the geography of Egypt allowed the Egyptians to have a good outlook at life. So at least at this thesis statement, a bit better, they made the connection to the optimistic, or the words used here was a good outlook. That's an improvement. This is the best one. This is one option. It's not the only option, but a better option. The predictable flooding of the Nile provided stability, which was reflected in an optimistic view of the afterlife. So you can see the connection here. They're not using the word geography, predictable flooding the Nile. You're showing, hey, I know what the geography of Egypt, but it has the Nile River, which flooded predictably. And then you're also making the connection, so you have the flooding of the Nile, and then you make the connection to an optimistic view in the afterlife. So this essay, you know exactly where it's going. You see the argument that's going to be made. You'd be talking about the cyclical nature of the Nile, and then the optimistic view of the afterlife. You could talk about the weighing of the heart, all that stuff that we talked about last time. Now today, like I said, we're going to be talking about these two civilizations, the Indus River Valley and the Olmec. Yay! Okay, so we'll start with the Indus River Valley. The discovery of the Indus River Valley dates back to the mid-1800s. The British used to be in control of India, and a man who was building a railroad, this is around the time of railroads becoming popular, mid-1800s, was going and building a railroad and he needed some stone, and he had heard about a local place that had stone. Basically, locals would go and take up the stone. Well, he did that, built the railroad, and later on, in the early 1900s, another British guy had heard about these supposed stones that the railroad builder had found. And he went, and he was an archaeologist, and found the civilization of the Indus River Valley, specifically at Harappa. Harappa is where they first found this Indus River Valley. So from there, they've gone and done a whole bunch of excavations all over the Indus River Valley, or modern-day India, and found more stuff of this civilization. Pretty cool civilization. We'll take a look at it today. So the Indus River runs through there, and is known as the Indus River Valley. It's a very, very protected area geographically, meaning you have the sea to the south and then mountains to the side, which allowed the Indus River Valley to remain relatively protected from outside invaders. They did trade with others, but there's not much evidence that they were a militaristic culture. So they limited outside contact, and they kind of did their own thing. And the Indus River provided, just like we talked about Mesopotamia and Egypt, a source of water, irrigation, planting, fresh soil, stuff like that. In addition, if you look at the Indus River Valley, we see that they're an urban society. Urban means city, so they developed in different forms of the city. And the crazy thing about the Indus River Valley is that their cities were very planned. Like, if you looked at them, certain buildings were only up to a certain height. And there would be some form, we're assuming that the government had restrictions. They had municipal governments, that's the abbreviation for governments. Municipal means like a local government, like a city government. Another crazy thing about the Indus River Valley is that they had hydraulic engineering. What I mean by that is they had a system of sewers. People tend to think that sewers, the Romans perfected them, which they did. They had a very extensive sewer system. But years and years before the Romans, the Indus River Valley, everybody basically had their own form of a sewer system, a toilet in their house that went underground and out out of the city. Very advanced. And the kind of sad part about it is you could argue that this form of sewage system is actually better than a lot of areas in India and Pakistan today, which is the same area. No large structures. We don't find any like fortresses or religious temples, so we don't have any ziggurats or pyramids. That's a bit different. And it's a very egalitarian society. What egalitarian means is equal. When we go and look at the homes, they're all about the same size. Means they probably had a relatively prosperous society, and maybe they had some form of a kind of socialist or communist type government that distributed wealth evenly. It's kind of like a feel-good hippie type society, if you want to think about it that way. Here's the Great Bath, which is the area that they use for some form of a great bath. We don't have that much original of names as historians. What was it used for? We don't exactly know, but a good historical guess would, this area obviously would all be filled up with water. A good historical guess would be that the Great Bath was used for some form of ritual cleansing, some form of religious cleansing like a baptism, something along those lines. Here's a picture of the Great Bath and how it would have looked like in its heyday. It would have been covered, obviously, and that's not there over time. But you can still see the remains down there in that previous picture. Here's a covered drain in the street. Like I said, if you look here, you can see the idea of the sewage, and it basically runs downhill, and the sewage would go out of the city. Very advanced for the time, pretty crazy. Religion, we don't know a lot. We go and when we look at the religion, we see some stuff that involves animals, figurines like that, people. And the reason why we don't know a lot, as much as we do about Mesopotamia or Egypt, is we can't read their writing. And if we can't read their writing, it's a lot more difficult. It's more up to archaeology than history because, like I said, history involves writing. If you go to the British Museum, you can actually see these stamp seals, which were used to identify stuff. You'd stamp it into wet clay. These are actually swastikas. And don't get scared. This has nothing to do with the Nazis. If you know anything about the swastika, it's an ancient symbol that's been used for a long time, including the Indus River Valley. So this had a lot of meaning before the Nazi movement. So obviously it has different connotation today. But these were what we call a swastika shape that were used in the ancient Indus River Valley. Like I said, a big thing you want to know is that the writing, we don't know what this means. No computer and no person has been able to crack it yet. We haven't been able to figure it out. Maybe we'll find some form of Rosetta Stone and be able to one day figure out what are they writing about, which would be pretty amazing, and we have a lot more information on the society. But at this point, we don't have that much writing that a computer can crack it. Hopefully in your lifetime, we'll be able to find out what they're actually saying. Art. A lot of people think about the Greeks and Romans perfecting arts. First the Greeks perfecting sculpture, which they did. But this female figurine here is known for being an advanced piece of art. And let me talk here about a second about her. It's advanced because if you look at like an Egyptian-style statue, it's very, very symmetrical. The person is standing with their arms straight to the side, their legs are together, and that's easier to make a statue that way. It doesn't tip over, and you don't have to be as advanced. When you look at the Greek statues, there's movement, there's a lot of realism. And this quote here, which you talked about in class, basically the guy who found this statue said, I couldn't believe it. This was thousands of years before the Greeks, and this is a Greek-like statue before the Greeks. So there's evidence that there were other civilizations in the world that were actually quite talented at sculpture. Now we're going to be switching gears, so that's the Indus River Valley. Now we're going to be talking about the Olmec. Now the Olmecs are actually discovered around the same time that the Indus River Valley was. Basically a farmer found one of these colossal heads, and I'll show you what they look like. They're pretty crazy. And then an archaeologist went there and they started to excavate and find some of the Olmec remains. But we're moving to a completely different part of the world. We're moving to Mexico today. Now, like I said, the geography, it is in Mexico. And two different points that I want to make. One, this is a completely different part of the world. The previous civilizations we've talked about, the big three, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus River Valley, are more or less the same area of the world, Middle East-ish, if you want to call it that. Now we're going to South America, and we're having a civilization that formed there. So you didn't have to form in that area. And second, they did have rivers, but they didn't have a specific river valley. It's more of a swampland, and if you see, there's all these like smaller rivers, kind of tributaries, that they're going to develop at. So you didn't necessarily need a river valley to form civilization, but it's just very helpful to have that. Society and politics, we don't know a lot. Both of these civilizations are based a lot on conjecture. We don't see a big priestly level or a big soldier level. But we do assume there is some form of like a king on top in the hierarchy and probably a lot of farmers, stuff like that. So it's a lot of conjecture on our part. but that's kind of the way it goes with the Olmec. The ball game basically invented a form of a ball game where they would use their hips and they would go and hit the ball back and forth between each other. You may have seen this in a movie, and it kind of is later traced to some of the later cultures in Central and South America as well. These are the heads. This is what, when people think about the Olmec, this is what they think about. These heads, depending upon how big they are, they're either 5 to 11 feet tall. They weigh multiple tons. They're very, very heavy. But they've actually evidence that they moved them around, and people have tried to figure out how they moved them around. Did they move them on a boat, or did they move them through land? We don't really know. What were their purposes? We're not sure, but a conjecture is that these people are actually ball players, and this is like the helmet that they would wear, and the ball player itself would be the king. So maybe like it would be a king showing him in his traditional ball player like outfit. So that's a conjecture that's been said with the colossal heads. But this is what they're very known for. The heads were usually the volcanic rock that they were going to get them from was like 100 miles away. So they got the rock somehow. And the volcanic rock, I'll show you a picture here in a sec. So to give you a sense of size and proportion, this is how big one of them is. They're huge, as you can tell. So here's some of the Basalt Formation, which is basically the cooled down volcanic lava rock they would go and carve out the Olmec heads out of. It's a very famous statue called the Wrestler, which is associated with the Olmec, because he kind of looks like a wrestler. Some people suspect it's a forgery because it doesn't really tend to fit with the other style of Olmec sculpture that they found. If it's not a forgery, it's still pretty interesting, or even if it is. It's meant to be viewed from 360 degrees, and it's known, similar to the one that we just looked at in India, for its sense of movement, perspective, and the idea, basically, if you looked at other Olmec sculptures, you'd see it's really broad at the base. This one's not so broad, which is harder to do as a sculptor because you keep that guy from tipping around. So that's the statue known as the Wrestler. Here's a face mask in jade as well, so they may have used this for a religious purpose, maybe acting, something like that. And the question of bloodletting and human sacrifice. There's some evidence that they use the ritual of bloodletting, which is basically you cut a part of the body, squeeze the blood onto a piece of paper, light it on fire, and offer it up as a sacrifice to the gods. We also see this evidence of a were-jaguar a lot. Were means human, and then jaguar like the big cat, like a werewolf means human and wolf combined. The were-jaguar, which may have been associated with the infant sacrifice, human sacrifice, because there's areas where we find were-jaguars, and then very close to them we find a bunch of infant bones. So there's been some speculation that this culture actually went in and killed babies in order to please the gods. Not so fun. Bloodletting, this would have been used to cut the people, would have been basically like the razor blade, and like I talked in class, it would be very, very painful. This is another Olmec sculpture. You can actually see this woman, or man, can't really tell, is holding a baby. So most likely a woman, but a baby in the form of a were-jaguar. So you see the kind of connection between a were-jaguar and possibly a baby. And here's another spot of someone holding a baby as well. And last but not least, this is the Great Pyramid of Venta, very famous pyramid. So there you go, the Indus River Valley and the Olmec.